Welcome to another live webinar series brought to you by STADA, the Singapore Training and Development Association, a not-for-profit organization focusing in workplace learning and development. My name is William Ledbetter, and I will be your host for today. The topic of today's webinar is sleep, emotional intelligence and interpersonal effectiveness, natural bedfellows. Inconsistent or insufficient sleep can be costly for business, impacting decision-making and judgment, interpersonal relations, absenteeism, safety, productivity, and health, including immune functioning, susceptibility to illness, and psychological well-being. Emotional and social competence facilitates effective leadership, and quality and quantity of sleep plays an important role in the ability to regulate emotions, as cited from the article by Gujar in 2011. This session will summarize a recent study exploring the relationship between sleep, emotional intelligence, and interpersonal effectiveness. Implications for helping individuals and organizations reduce both perceived and actual costs associated with poor sleep will also be discussed. Our speaker today is Kenneth M. Nowak, PhD. He's a licensed psychologist and co-founder of ENVISIA Learning and OFactor. Dr. Nowak received his doctorate degree in counseling psychology from the University of California, Los Angeles, and has published extensively in the areas of 360-degree feedback, assessment, health psychology, and behavioral medicine. Ken serves on Daniel Goleman's Consortium for Research on Emotional Intelligence in Organizations and serves as associate editor for the APA journal, Consulting Psychology Journal, Practice and Research. He is the author of 2 coaching books, including Clueless, Coaching People Who Just Don't Get It, and From Insight to Improvement, Leveraging 360-degree feedback, and has published extensively in the area of 360-degree feedback, habit and behavioral change, and stress and resilience. He is the author of a well-known stress and health risk appraisal, the Stress Profile, published by Western Psychology Services, as well as other validated personality, career, and 360-degree feedback assessments. For those of you who are streaming this session live from YouTube, you can drop your question or comment on the chat box next to the video frame. So now, enough about this. Let's move on to our speaker. Without further ado, I present to you Dr. Kenneth Nowak.
Thank you, William, for that wonderful introduction, and good morning, all of you that are joining me worldwide. Let me give you a roadmap of where I'd like to go in the next 45 to 50 minutes, and we'll save some time for questions. And certainly if there's a burning question in between, post that and William will interrupt me, and I'll do my very best since I can't see the chat box or questions that may come in. So I'd like to share a little bit of the framework of the research I've been involved in as an organizational and health psychologist for many years, and been very interested in the relationship between sleep and the growing interest of organizations today about how employees and talent at all levels who lack adequate rest and sleep really do impact the bottom line of business. So I'll provide a little background of the science of sleep and share some of the latest research at a practical level that indicates what we know that's pretty obvious, that lack of sleep does impair job performance, impacts absenteeism, accidents, etc. And I'll share one of my own research studies just recently published. Again, it may be a joke that we need a research study to prove the obvious, but nonetheless, it is the first research study that's conclusively seen a link between lack of sleep in leaders and emotional intelligence and how they treat their talent. So that's where I'd like to go. And let me, again, we've had a little introduction to who I am. So let's talk a little bit about sleep and what we know and really why it's important for the world of work. In my earlier days as a health psychologist and researcher, I certainly spent quite a bit of time and energy in research and factors that affect health and well-being, performance, productivity, engagement. We all know the importance of physical activity and eating and nutrition, and certainly stress management. And with the growing resurgence of interest at a practical level and mindfulness meditation and other techniques, we're certainly seeing all of those creep into the world of work that certainly have a strong impact on performance and health. and certainly social support. And our research in that area has been quite provocative, that certainly suggests that toxic relationships with one's partner, with one's boss, colleagues, peers in the world of work has a significant impact on, again, retention, engagement, satisfaction, productivity. But what's becoming very clear to me is that one of the areas that certainly in the last few years that organizations have become a little bit more wise to, for some important reasons we'll point out, is sleep and lack of sleep in employees. It isn't something directly that organizations can control, but certainly they can influence. And as I'll wind up my presentation this morning with some practical tips and suggestions for those of you that are in leadership roles and decision-making roles in organization, some things you should consider. And if you're part of this webinar and are more independent practitioners, coaches, and consultants, I also have a list of tips and suggestions for things you can do to enhance your knowledge and possible interventions with individuals that might be sleep deprived or fatigued. So very important topic for many reasons. Some of our own research shows just a quick link between sleep and psychological well-being and happiness. And this is with a sample, a random sample, and a very large database that we have that showed a very strong and significant interaction between quality and quantity of sleep using the measure that we have for many years in our validated stress and health risk appraisal, which I'll share a little bit more about, and a measure of psychological health and well-being. So it's, again, pretty intuitive that people that are sleep deprived are certainly impaired to an extent, but certainly our level of happiness and well-being is affected by our health. One of the reasons I take sleep so seriously from a health perspective, there's been quite a bit of research. Sheldon Cohn, for many years, is a premier researcher in the United States that has, as we were talking with William, taken college students who, again, will do just about anything for money, but he's very famous for a protocol that he's used for many years in which he takes students into his lab and will actually inject rhinoviruses, cold viruses, into the noses of paid college students. He then quarantines them and keeps them in his lab, and then manipulates a wide variety of variables to take a look at who develops the rhinoviruses translated into colds and viruses. And in one of his two published studies of his, one in 2009, another in 2015, using two different measures of sleep, he basically found and was able to validate that when people are sleep deprived, and he did that purposely in the lab, their immunity was much more impaired, and they were dramatically more likely, almost 3 times more likely than the group that was well rested and got adequate rest and sleep, actually to develop a cold. So we do know from the basic physiology of how the immune system works, sleep deprived employees are definitely at risk for getting sick. It's just 2 studies by Sheldon Cohn that certainly emphasize that point that we can prove pretty easily in the sleep lab. We also know that sleep and leadership effectiveness is a very important area. My research and work is with toxic leaders. I refer to them as competent jerks, and when I'm sleep deprived, I might even call them boss holes. But these are the individuals that may possess pretty strong experience and skills, but at the end of the day are just very toxic, very difficult to deal with. And one of the really interesting studies done by a psychologist at University of California at Berkeley, Matthew Walker, used some of the latest technology brain imagery, and we call it functional MRI. And what he basically did is, again, take pretty healthy subjects. Again, these were college students, deprive them of 35 hours of sleep, which is pretty equivalent to losing a night's sleep and not being able to nap. And then actually measured activity in the brain while they viewed a number of positive and negative images. And what he found, again, validated what's intuitive to all of us, and that is that sleep-deprived individuals actually have a diminishing area of the brain that is influencing reasoning, willpower, goal setting, logical thinking, and that's what we call the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, part of the new brain, if you will. So again, things like making good decisions, solving problems from, again, brain imagery is certainly deactivated or less activated in sleep deprived sleep-deprived individuals. So nothing really brand new that you've probably intuitively experienced when you're tired and pooped out. But again, we're bringing the lab into the world of science and how that impacts with employees. We also know a very startling set of research studies suggests that even a few hours less sleep than you typically need can impair just, again, your rational, your thinking, your ability to make good sound judgments. And a single night of inadequate or poor sleep, if we were to give you psychomotor, vigilant test, memory test, look at personality changes, one night of poor sleep is equivalent to being legally drunk, at least where I live and work in California. So people subjectively may say there's no problem, I can actually function well, I can drive farm machinery, I can operate on patients, but we do know from good sound behavioral research is individuals who lack sleep, even a few hours, are significantly impaired both interpersonally, cognitively, and it's as if you've had a cognitive stroke to some extent. Again, because of these impacts, organizations for many years haven't really tuned into it, but because of the cost today of accidents, the cost today of making mistakes, consumers, our internal stakeholders and employees, organizations are beginning to take a hard look at what we can do to create an environment where employees can get adequate rest and sleep. That might also include helping to allow employees to actually psychologically detach from today's always on and our society where it's very hard to get away from the world of work even when you want to. So a pretty important slide. We certainly know from tremendous research that's piled up for many, many years that simply a lack of sleep is work-related and does impact a wide variety of variables affecting performance, safety, productivity, attention, conflict. And my work and my research also looks at the impact on psychological health and physical well-being. So certainly even a few hours lack of sleep, as Sheldon Cohn demonstrated or more, creates a susceptibility in our immune system to fight off just the common cold virus that's around, and certainly something we can catch from our children, from coworkers, or from just being in places publicly with people that have a cold. So how do we know what we know about science? The science of sleep isn't that old. Unlike other areas in human resources and training and development where we may have 100+ years, the science of sleep is a relatively new science. And there are ways we can actually ask individuals subjectively how well they slept, and they're moderately reliable to what we can do by bringing people into a sleep lab or using physiological measures. And this is typically called polysomnography. So it's a whole science of studying how people sleep by measuring a wide variety of physiological types of parameters. And certainly today, the popularity of devices, tablets, our phones, with the ability to measure certain aspects of physiology gives us proxies. They may not be 100% reliable as a sleep clinic and sleep lab, but they certainly give us a pretty good indication of how often you might toss and turn, and using some algorithms that have been developed by vendors gives us some better ideas when you might go to sleep, stay asleep, move into light and deeper stages of sleep, and even begin to dream based on body movements. And the best newer technology and apps certainly would be ones that are looking at heart rate variability. So some of the newer technologies that are out today that could be linked back to our phones and smartphones certainly give us a little bit better and more accurate physiological data. And these seem to be more highly correlated with actual lab studies. The older technologies that just measured actigraphs or body movements were certainly full of errors. There's a couple of sleep disorders where body movements are either severely impaired or accelerated. So we would find using these devices really large errors in really determining are you sleeping soundly just because you didn't move or you moved pretty dramatically in your sleep. So all that to say, if you're going to be investigating or using any of the newer apps, ask and inquire and make sure that vendors are measuring heart rate variability, whether it's, again, something you're wearing or taping onto your wrist or your head, and again, remotely through Bluetooth or wired to your smartphone or another device in measuring sleep. it would be much more accurate if you can, in fact, validate that it's measuring this physiological measure. So we also know that sleep is an interesting drive. It's one of those biological drive like hunger and others that we do know without it, our body from a physiological perspective is really forcing us in a positive way to go to sleep. And all of us, whether we know it or not, have two dips. Our body naturally wants us to go to sleep. Cycle that the majority of workers are, which wouldn't be swing shifts or night shifts, we would have a biological pressure to probably optimize our need to go to sleep between 1 and 3 in the morning. And that'll vary a little bit if you are what we call a morning person or a lark or a night person or a night owl. And we have a second dip in the afternoon. And that for most of us would appear between about 2 and 4 in the afternoon. And it would correspond quite a bit to what some cultures call the siesta or sleep time. So you can actually say, I have this reversed on the slide, but it's 2 to 4 in the afternoon, 1 to 3 in the morning would correspond to when we're most likely to fall asleep. If I could take any of you on the webinar this morning and put you into a room where there's absolutely no way you could tell what time it is, no clocks, no cues, our body would actually do something that's called free running. Our biological need of sleep is a little bit longer than 25 hours. So tonight, if I say just go to bed when you're tired, you'd probably go to bed at a pretty regular time that you typically do if you're on a schedule that isn't too dramatically changing. And tomorrow night, interestingly, your body would tell you, hey, I'm sleepy, let's go to bed about an hour later. And the third night, it's an hour later from the time before. So your biological clock runs free, if you will. And if we keep you into a time-free environment, literally for 12 days, you would be 12 hours out of sync with the environment. And then if we let you out of the lab back into your regular home and work environment, you'd actually want to go to bed and go to sleep the very opposite time that you're optimized to be awake. So we call this phenomena free running, and with sleep there are two things that reset our clock, very important to know. One is called light. Zeitgebers, light and dark, actually creates to our brain a resetting of our biological clock. It's one of the reasons for any of you that do any international travel and experience jet lag, we often tell you to get out and sync yourself to, again, the light and dark schedule that you're on as best you can and as rapidly as you can. And the other is called the social Zeitgeber. So who you hang out with will dramatically influence the locking in of your sleep clock as well as other rhythms. If there's women on this webinar who have lived together in a dormitory or an apartment building, you'll notice that women that live together for a period of time actually will begin to ovulate and have their menstrual periods pretty close to each other. It isn't as if they're writing a note or emailing each other to say, let's do this together. It's the social time setter of that biological rhythm that locks them into a particular longer period than 24 hours. So sleep is regulated by lack of it or the presence of it, and by a very strong biological rhythm. And when each of you decide to go to bed tonight, you will go through some pretty structured architecture of what we call sleep. In fact, the first 90 minutes or so, you go into a type of sleep that's described as non-rapid eye movement sleep, and it would actually be the stages of lighter sleep to deeper sleep. And at about 90 minutes into your sleep tonight, you will be in the deepest stage of what we call stage 4 sleep. And typically there's body movements. Typically you may have some type of visual imagery, not very vivid. And after about 90 minutes, each of us on average would have our very first dream period. And the dream period's marked physiologically with some really interesting differences. For example, our voluntary muscles are completely inhibited. Certainly, obviously, you can breathe, but it's nature's way, an evolutionary way of making sure you don't act out your dreams. So when you sleep, basically, you're kind of paralyzed. And it's one of the reasons that we know that sleepwalking, which is actually highly genetically predetermined, families kind of do it together, occurs more often in non-REM sleep than it would in REM sleep. So this cycle will repeat itself about every 90 minutes. As you can see in the upper right-hand corner, if you're a young adult or older adult, we have our deepest type of sleep early in the night, and then as we would sleep 5, 6, 7, 8, or 9 hours, we would move into lighter stages of sleep. We don't have those deep sleep, and the length of our dream periods actually increase. And as we get older, we find that our sleep architecture actually changes as we see as we age, and that we have a little bit less of deep sleep and a little bit more fragmented dream sleep. And we do believe, as I'll share in a moment, sleep has to do with this architecture. So this is pretty typical, and as you would imagine, there's a lot of variance with individuals with pretty interesting sleep disorders. And for those of you that are doing international travel, you're actually shifting your clock, if you will, and it will impair quite a bit your ability to stay on that particular sleep. So one of the questions I think researchers, and we've all been asking for many years, is why do we have to sleep? What is it about all species of animals that do require sleep? What's going on? And we finally have some answers today, and we truly believe that there's two intertwined purposes of sleep. And one is, while we sleep, our brain actually opens up some pretty interesting lymphatic canals. These would be areas that actually help, if you can visualize the brain getting rid of metabolites that actually are no longer needed. It's our body's automatic garbage disposal system, and this occurs a little bit more predominantly during dream sleep, but it's something that we see quite often during sleep, that these amyloid canals actually open. And it's also correlated very strongly with the collection and consolidation of memory. So we do believe a lot of other things occur during sleep, but the basic reason the human species and animal species probably has evolved to have sleep being so powerful is it really is a necessary reason and time that our brain gets rid of waste materials, particularly what's called beta amyloid, which has been a big possible instigator for dementia and Alzheimer. And that clearance is something that we see quite frequently when we go to bed at night. So again, a lot of interesting debates on why we do need to sleep, but over an 85-year lifespan, for example, we may sleep nearly 10,000 full days. So quite a large chunk of the human experience. And again, when we ask how much sleep do we normally need, we have to go back to research in free running environments, and we find that the majority of humans worldwide basically sleep between about 7 and 8.5 hours. There's certainly, again, on a normal curve, people that sleep a little bit less, people that sleep a little bit more. But in general, that rule of thumb or heuristic is we really need between 7 and 8 hours to optimize our ability to be healthy physically and psychologically. And if you follow any of the work of Anders Ericsson, who's pretty famous on how deliberate practice and gave rise to the myth, but was popularized by a couple authors, that if you do anything for 10,000 hours, you will actually be an expert at it. That's been disproven, but in Anders Ericsson's research, what people don't realize is they did find that people who are experts at what they do actually had a significantly higher level of sleep. And their pattern of sleep, as you'll see in just a moment, was to practice something, sleep on it, wake up, practice again a little bit more. And that did seem to consolidate the ability for neural circuits to regulate and enhance effectiveness. So we do find that the human experience is somewhere in that 7 to 8 period of hours a night. You might be uniquely a little bit different, but if you're like most humans, you kind of fit into that area. And if you take a look at sleep worldwide, it's interesting because Singapore is one of those countries that actually ranks at the bottom of cities in the world that get least hours of sleep a night, somewhere on average about 6.3, so 6.5 hours, relative to someone that might live in Australia or even London that are getting at least 30 minutes or more. So we might look at this and say, well, gosh, does that have any impairment on longevity or mortality and health? And interestingly, we find the answer is no. And if we take a look at mortality rates by the World Health Organization, and let's just take Singapore, actually Singaporeans rate number 3 in terms of life expectancy, both males and females. So even though Japan, South Korea, Singapore from a statistical perspective are getting less sleep doesn't seem to be impacting, obviously, long-term health, mortality, and longevity. So I thought I'd share these slides with you again so you don't reach a conclusion that necessarily there's a tie to lack of sleep and longevity, although there is some research that suggests that any individuals in Singapore that might be getting less sleep than 6.5 hours, we call them short sleep, might be at risk for certain illnesses and even a shorter lifespan. And the research worldwide sort of supports short sleepers in that area. Our own research is using a proprietary set of questions in our stress and health risk appraisal. It's called the stress profile. And in a sample of over 50,000 working adults worldwide, we found some interesting statistics that a large percent of employees are rating and evaluating that they're not getting adequate rest and sleep, and that quite a number, up to almost a quarter, are saying that they're pooped out and really tired while they're at work. We call it presenteeism. Their body's there, their mind and spirit may be there physically, but they're not all there cognitively. And we find, surprisingly, up to 5 to 8% are actually telling us they're not sleeping at all during a night. And again, if those are my surgeons or my dentists or people that are flying my airplanes, I'm really hoping it's not those 8 to 10% that did not get an adequate set of sleep the day before. If we take a look at napping, one of my colleagues who is a worldwide guru, he served in the United States. He was a presidential appointee to the National Transportation Safety Board. So his name is Mark Rosekine. He is psychologist, schooled at Yale University, but did his practice in sleep at Stanford, and they're a great sleep disorders clinic. He was one of the first to actually study airline pilots around the world, and at least worldwide, pilots aren't allowed to sleep while they're in the cockpit. They can go in the back of the plane or in bunks that are outside of the plane itself to sleep, but the FAA, Federal Administration laws, don't allow sleeping in the cockpit. But Mark's study was one of the first to demonstrate that a short nap, at least under 20 minutes, can be highly beneficial for performance and memory and just psychovigilance that's really required to fly an airplane. And even though his study was published in 1995, there still hasn't been much change in policy to really allow pilots, while they're working, to take short naps, particularly in the cockpit. So I'll see in some of my tips and suggestions as I wind up tonight that organizations are increasingly supporting employees that are really fatigued and tired on premises, even with special rooms that are being built for employees, to go ahead and take a nap. Anything longer than 20 minutes actually could be disruptive and leading into full-blown sleep, and might actually cause something that we label sleep inertia. That is waking up, which we've all done, by sleeping a little bit longer than a 20-minute nap and kind of feeling less than optimum. So if you can, naps less than 20 minutes seem to optimize concentration and attention and energy, and certainly would be recommended. We certainly know people that take short naps, again, less than about 30 minutes a day, or frequently, do report again significant increase in psychological well-being or happiness. But we find culturally and from a predictive perspective with research, people who regularly take daytime naps, that would be every day, they just go and take a nap, we find they're actually at increased risk for cardiovascular disease and all-cause mortality. Not really sure what's going on there, but the latest hypothesis is that people that have a need to nap daily are probably sleep deprived at a dramatic extent, and the body again is saying, hey, you need to slow down, take a few minutes, go nap. And if you don't do it, what creeps into the brain are something called micro sleeps. These are very brief episodes within 1 to 5 seconds, where our brain actually sort of shuts down in certain areas, not the entire brain, of course. And these are called micro sleeps. And we've all experienced that when we're really fatigued, or when we're driving a car and we just sort of zone out for a moment or two. If we had you wired up and we could measure particularly brain waves, we would notice that you're slipping in from wakefulness to the beginnings of stage 1 non-REM sleep. So sort of an interesting slide. We certainly know things to consider and what employees should avoid both to get to sleep and fall asleep. Alcohol certainly will make you lethargic and groggy, but it also has an effect of inhibiting dream sleep. And the next night, if you have an episode of drinking, you won't realize this till the next night. You'll have what's called a REM or dream rebound, with an increased likelihood of more restlessness during sleep. And certainly a growing evidence that tablets and TV monitors, particularly the blue ray lights from those devices, actually reset your biological clock. They close down the melatonin producing areas of the brain. So certainly if you get a text message at 3 in the morning and you think, oh gosh, I wonder who that is, I'm going to go read it, that blue light emitted from your device, even with the new Apple devices that have the nighttime type of filters on it, may still trigger to your brain that, hey, it's time to wake up, it's time to stop production of melatonin, and a signal to your brain that you're beginning your working day. So again, you want to do your very best to sort of avoid those types of devices and tablets and text messages on your phone that are near your bed, and just inhibit yourself from really checking those out. Otherwise, again, you might find yourself pretty sleep deprived the next day. Fatigue could be physical fatigue, it could be emotional fatigue. And we really see this as a little bit different from sleep deprivation. So fatigue could be caused by things of just spending too much time on a task or thinking about things, or again, a physical reaction to doing something. But certainly it has a pretty big role in what employees today are dealing with on the job. And extreme fatigue that's chronic, if it's not an autoimmune or immune-mediated disorder like chronic fatigue syndrome, certainly could lead to what we now recognize as job burnout, or at least a facet of emotional exhaustion, which is one of the key components of job burnout. And we know when we're sleepy, one of the things that builds up while we're asleep at night is an area called adenosine, which is very interesting. It's created while we're awake during the day. So right now, as you're listening to me, if we were to measure and draw blood and measure adenosine throughout the day, it would actually increase. And when we see high levels of it, it certainly does lead to sleepiness. So one of the things that counteracts adenosine is caffeine and coffee and caffeinated drinks. And it's certainly one of the reasons that we know that caffeine keeps people awake. It's an antagonist to this particular chemical that is related to sleepiness. So this is a practical tip. It may sound a little strange, but there's several research studies that say if you really want to optimize alertness and performance, one of the little hacks or tricks you might consider if you like any caffeinated or drinks that contain caffeine might be to take a brief nap, then have a shot of your favorite coffee, and then go back to work. And we find that it takes about 15 or 20 minutes for the caffeine and the stimulant in coffee or caffeinated drinks to kick in. So that combination of a nap followed by a caffeinated drink is one of the hacks that research studies really suggest people do significantly better on cognitive tasks and psychomotor vigilant tasks. So if you're into it, you might just find that that combination is actually better than just a nap alone or having coffee alone, but that combination in that order seems to be pretty beneficial for keeping people alert and at a high level of performance. And just recently, has very little to do with sleep, but there's some very, very recent research that's been published with very large populations. If you like coffee, whether it's caffeinated or decaffeinated, the more you drink, does seem to be an upper limit of about 5 drinks per day, is a significant predictor of mortality and longevity. So again, that little hack of a nap and caffeinated beverages, coffee, might be one that you can consider when you're pretty pooped out. So let me move into the work I've been doing in leadership and sleep. Have a lot of intuitiveness to what you'll hear here. There's certainly a few studies that I can share with you, but interestingly, there's not as many as you'd like in the published literature. Matthew Barnes, who's at the University of Washington, has done some of the latest research is quite provocative, and what he's been able to demonstrate in one published study is that working for a sleep-deprived boss or leader actually has a direct impact on the level of engagement of the employees or direct reports that report to that individual. So it's sort of a very interesting study published by Matthew Barnes that is the first to show a link between sleep deprivation in leaders and morale and satisfaction and engagement of workers that are reporting to that leader. And Galtney's research is quite fascinating. She's looked at what happens basically when people leave work on Friday and change their sleep patterns on Saturday and Sunday, and then kind of come back to their week the following Monday. And what she found in 2 published studies, interesting, just focusing on leaders, is the leaders that had the greatest change in weekend to weeknight. In other words, they slept in a little bit longer on Saturday and Sunday, and then they tried to go to bed at a relatively reasonable hour Sunday night and just laid there, are actually shifting their biological rhythm and causing a slight jet lag in a negative sense, so that people can't fall asleep on Sunday. We call that but that sleep and that ability to shift one's rhythm, impairing sleep in leaders, had a significant and direct impact on performance ratings from peers, but not supervisors. And that certainly parallels our own research, which I'll summarize in just a moment. So not a lot of research directly on leaders and sleep, yet there's a lot of anecdotal evidence. And again, my work with competent jerks, a lot of times when I'm doing coaching, I actually learn that people have impaired sleep due to medical reasons or things that they're doing secondary to sleep itself, but we do find that their sleep is impaired, leading to a whole host of interpersonal, physical, psychological, and emotional kinds of outcomes that are pretty important in the world of work. So this is the question that we asked, and that is, does lack of sleep in leaders impact the practices of leaders on talent and employees, giving you some hints of what we've learned already. And one of the articles that was published last year of mine was called Toxic Bosses May Cause Health Risk. And it was a summary of the research literature on how working for a difficult boss, a competent jerk, might create a psychologically unhealthy environment for direct reports, and more importantly, impact directly absenteeism, and even be at risk for cardiovascular disease. So what we did very briefly was a very simplistic study in a way. We took 109 senior leaders. They were also in an MBA program at a very prominent university in Los Angeles, and we had them complete our sleep measure self-report, and we all concurrently had them complete a measure, a validated measure of emotional intelligence, comparing their self-ratings to those of their direct reports, their own leader, and their colleagues. So the protocol of the study was a concurrent study looking at self-reported sleep and ratings of emotional intelligence by the leaders that were pretty high-powered. All of them were burning the midnight oil, working very hard in their EMBA program, but in their own right, fully employed in very senior level positions, mostly vice presidents in pretty diverse industries. So that was the group we looked at. Just a word for those of you that are in kind of the new label for emotional intelligence, is it's a pretty muddy concept at the moment. And there are at least 4 very different ways to conceptualize what that term might mean, and equally at least 4 very diverse ways of measuring social and emotional competence. So one of those is more personality based, and all of you in the webinar might, who are using emotional intelligence tools, be familiar with the personality-based measure that's published by MHS, a worldwide global publisher of assessment tools, and they use Reuben Bar-On's emotional intelligence EQI. And it is very similar to 5-factor personality inventories. And in fact, some of the criticisms of this particular approach is that it overlaps or is confounded pretty directly and dramatically with typical 5-factor personality inventories. Nonetheless, it certainly is a very popular tool that's out in the market with tremendous research, again, showing links between low and high scores with a wide variety of performance outcomes and health outcomes. A second very different way to measure emotional intelligence isn't asking people to answer questions subjectively. It's actually teasing them and challenging them to determine what they would do behaviorally. And we call these ability-based measures of emotional and social competence, popularized by really the individual who popularized the name emotional intelligence, who was Peter Salovey, who is actually now the president at the University at Harvard, but was one of the seminal researchers and a great contributor to the emotional intelligence literature. He and his colleagues developed a skills or ability-based measure that's abbreviated the MESCEIT, M-S-C-E-I-T. And the MESCEIT might give you pictures of people's faces and ask you what emotions that are there, or give you scenarios and ask you to actually demonstrate how you'd behave. So it isn't something that's self-report or subjectively based. It is more ability-based. And a third is what we kind of call a mixed measure of emotional intelligence, again, popularized by Dan Goleman and his collaboration with Richard Boyatzis and his team at the old Hay Group, now Korn Ferry. And it is, with all respect, a kitchen sink and very similar to our own competency-based 360 that has a myriad of things that are being measured. And finally, the newer generation, very different conceptualization, is more trait emotional intelligence, which again looks somewhat like mixed measures. It will have things that we're looking at that may look like conscientiousness, and it may look like resilience, or even mind shift and mindset. And these are more popular to talk about these measures. You really want to ask the question, what model and what kind of way are you measuring and evaluating social and emotional competence? And in one of my published articles looking at defining and understanding the fat of emotional intelligence, what we now know today from some very, very solid meta-analytic research is that all of these measures, including mixed measures of emotional intelligence, do in fact predict at least supervisory ratings of job performance. So there's no argument that we're measuring something, but we haven't really known what it is. And if we were to control for the known ingredients that are behind these measures, in other words, if we administer Rubin Baron's emotional EQI and then measure supervisory performance, but simultaneously measure personality using a 5-factor inventory, or we look at something like self-efficacy or self-rated performance, we then find the association or correlation between the Rubin Baron EQI and job performance goes down to 0, meaning that what we're really learning is the active ingredients, or the secret sauce, if you will, that's behind these vendor tools is probably a mix of very old wine and really old bottles. It doesn't dilute the meaningfulness of these measures, but it does raise some implications that go beyond this webinar today about the use of social and emotional inventories for personnel selection, for coaching. And again, it's a little bit of a buyer beware market. Our particular measure fits into the mixed emotional intelligence area. It was patterned after Dan Goleman's construct of EI. It measures 22 competencies divided into 3 competency areas: how one manages one's own behavior and emotions, we call that the self-management competencies; how we play well with others, the interpersonal side of social and emotional competence. And we have a third that's a little unique from other vendors, as we believe the currency for measuring emotional intelligence when we're evaluating other people is really how we communicate in writing, verbally, and non-verbally with others. So this is our model that, again, is pretty popular in the EI world, nothing brand new there. And like most multi-rater and 360 tools, which is one of the better ways of getting at social and emotional competence, and the running joke in the research community is, of what value are self-reports in measuring emotional intelligence for those people who lack it? So we do find that there's a very overinflation, overestimation of people who lack emotional intelligence. So for that reason, we're a big proponent of at least using if it's not ability-based measures, more multi-rater to compare and contrast self versus other perceptions in emotional intelligence. So our research, I won't go into our tool, is independent from ability-based research measures, so it has virtually no correlation with the Mesquite. And there's been about 8 or 9 validation studies showing that high scores on a particular measure is affiliated and associated with high performance and academic performance in a wide variety of industries and with a wide variety of job levels. So it is, in fact, one of those tools out there that we have a lot of faith that we're measuring in an accurate way, and actually is a tool that's cited in the very latest publication from the Center for Creative Leadership that reviewed and had their publication that provided psychometric approval of research behind 360 feedback tools. What we use to measure sleep is a self-report set of scales. It is a sleep scale that has 5 independent questions. A sample question might be, I received less sleep than required last night because you stayed up too late or had to get up too early. We do find in our research this sleep scale is independent from other fatigue measures. There's a number of tools out there to measure fatigue, emotional fatigue, physical fatigue. So again, what we're measuring is very much independent, and it definitely shows some convergent validity with other sleep measures that are out there. So we have a lot of faith that although it's self-reported, not a lab-based measure of sleep, it pretty highly moderately correlates with what we would do and find if we brought somebody into a lab. So what we do is we administer this tool. We're really looking at just the sleep scale. There's other areas that are of interest to an employee, but our research study focused again on the relationship between just sleep. We controlled for self-reported work and life stress as a moderating variable. And here would be an example of what we learned with some of the items from this particular study, that over half of the hardworking MBA students really said, as we would intuitively believe, they're really working pretty hard and they're pushing themselves even when they're pooped out and tired. So to have a full-time executive level position and go through an EMBA, an executive MBA program, as any of you have experienced doing school and work simultaneously know, it's pretty taxing. And again, we have these other statistics, which I won't read to you, that really does suggest this was a very, very successful, but fatigued and pretty sleep-deprived group. And it was a great sample then to take a look at how their direct reports, their peers, and certainly their boss viewed their social and emotional intelligence. So in a published study that I certainly can make available to any of you if you're interested, we found what's intuitive, and that is that statistically poor quality and lack of sleep in leaders was a very strong and significant predictor of emotional intelligence impairment by peers and direct reports. Like previous studies, we did not find that bosses of these leaders, their direct managers, found them to be impaired. So bosses have a very different set of filters, but direct reports very much were able to see through the lack of sleep and feel the impact of the lack of sleep of these leaders. And this is one of the findings is quite provocative, that it has a downward trickling effect. We call it emotional contagion on direct reports and people that leaders may in fact interact with on a day-to-day basis. So our results pretty simply and very easily say that if we have a leader who starts as a lovable star, lack of sleep will certainly move them in the direction of less emotional and social competence. It moves them to be a competent jerk. And certainly I've seen from my own research and practice in executive coaching, if a boss starts with being a boss hole or a competent jerk and they don't get adequate rest and sleep, certainly even tips them into a much more challenging and difficult area of being socially impaired with their direct reports. So I want to kind of conclude with a couple of quick implications for organizations and coaches, and we'll open it up to some questions. Again, I won't read these to you, but increasingly companies that are getting wise to the impact of fatigue and sleep on accidents, on presenteeism, on the costs for health insurance, and just the well-being of employees are beginning to look at education within the company, helping provide wellness and health promotion programs that also take a look at sleep. doing some things like providing some quiet spaces or even napping rooms, and certainly not penalizing people that really could use a quick 20-minute refresher to get back and do the magic and the great work that they're doing. And certainly encourage companies increasingly that are having and using annual engagement surveys to increase the number of questions that measure things such as perceived job stress and perceived workload and health and well-being and even presenteeism. And I guess, again, just intuitively, we want to take a look at, revisit, revise if necessary, what we're doing around our policies on holidays or vacations. If you have sick leave, as we do in the United States, it is something that many progressive companies are beginning to think about, because the inability to detach psychologically, even when on a holiday, can be pretty important for people coming back in a recovered state and doing some really great work. And certainly revisiting our travel guidelines and policies. Again, if I were to fly over right now to be with you, it is about almost 7 p.m. in the evening, a day behind you. Again, if I were to pop into Singapore right now on some body transport, it's about 10 o'clock in the morning, body clock time. In a few hours, I'm ready to shut down and go to sleep, and you're about ready to head out to lunch. So that type of jet lag, again, when we have senior leaders making critical decisions that are very important, when we have individuals that are doing things with physical competence that's necessary, when we have sports teams that we're looking for their peak performance, increasingly organizations are revisiting travel and the impact of jet lag on memory, on concentration, on decision-making, and interpersonal relationships. So there's quite a number of things that companies can do. And if you, again, are a coach or consultant on the webinar today and are saying, well, those are all great, but what are the implications for me? One of the things I would say is to consider adding to your toolkit tools that do look at fatigue and job burnout and stress and resilience. There's quite a number available, but those may be added value putting into your practice and knowing a little bit about it. And certainly if you're doing coaching and education in the lifestyle area at all, being more familiar with the latest technologies of remote devices and those devices and technologies that can monitor alertness, manage stress, and track sleep might be beneficial for knowing about and making a referral or recommendation to some of your clients. I also find that my coaching work anytime has never been able to separate work from non-work. We call it the spillover effect in research. So certainly if you're a really good coach, you will be invariably talking to your clients about how pooped out they are, warning them about job burnout, looking at areas of lifestyle management that will help them to be healthy physically and psychologically. And again, for most coaches that are out there, we don't, even if you're a licensed psychologist, you're not a medical doctor, and most of these things may be over your pay rate and your education band. So certainly have a cadre of colleagues who are physicians and allied health professionals, dietitians and nutritionists and licensed psychologists that specialize in things like substance use. Have them available in your contact list, and when needed, you should very much seek for a referral to gain more information at your end, or again, have your client go and seek them out. So I'll conclude with those tips and suggestions for organizations and for coaches and consultants, and we certainly can open up to any questions that you might have in our remaining time. And I'll turn it back over to our host to help me manage any questions that might have come in or those that could come in at this time.
Thank you, Kenneth. That was really very interesting. And there were so many things that I wanted to ask you about, but I think I will first of all check, I think I'll first of all check to see if there are any of our participants or viewers would like to ask a question. If you're currently online, my associate Anton will plug you in and you can ask the question right now. Or if you're with us right now over our YouTube feed, please go ahead and write in your question, and we'll go ahead and present it to Kenneth. I don't see anyone online at the moment with a question, so I'm going to take the privilege of the host by asking the first question of you. Now, early in your talk, Kenneth, you mentioned that there was an optimal nap time, and you had a slide that showed 15 minutes, 60 minutes, and then 90 to 120 minutes. And you mentioned that later on as well, that the 15 minutes seemed to be the time where if you took a nap at that time, you had the best balance of increased productivity with decreased reorientation of your sleep clock. Can I just reconfirm with you, first of all, that 15 minutes is the correct amount of time for us to try to nap?
Great question, and we do find, based on the research literature, and particularly from my colleague, Dr. Mark Rosekind, and his studies with NASA and the aviation community, that the optimum for performance and psychomotor vigilance seems to be that 15 to 20 minute window. Doesn't mean, again, if you slept for 30 minutes, that that's going to be counterproductive, but the longer we sleep, we start to move into a full sleep cycle. And one of the consequences, again, is this grogginess. Again, we call it sleep inertia that could occur. And too short a sleep, a nap, just 5 minutes, might feel good, but we don't seem to see the correlation with actual improvement in performance. So again, people will often ask, well, how do I know when 15 or 20 minutes are up? Again, you could put a little timer on your smartwatch or your phone or your tablet or your computer that sort of nudges you or wakes you up after 15 or 20 minutes. Not a hard and fast rule, but again, there's at least some empirical research suggesting that that window is probably the most that optimizes performance.
Thank you so much for that. And you gave me a natural segue into my next question. You had mentioned sleep apps like Fitbit, for example. And I remember having a Fitbit for a period of time, although the design of it was such that I kept losing the cap, and I finally got rid of the entire process. But while I had it, I was enjoying it telling me when my so-called deep sleep was or how long it took me to fall asleep. But you mentioned that there is a critical piece of data that any technology you use to measure your sleep cycle ought to show, and I believe I wrote it down correctly, was the heart rate variability. I was just wondering if you could just go over that one more time for our audience, because Singapore is one of those places where people really glom towards technology, especially self-betterment technology. And I think this might be something that our audience would really be appreciative of knowing more about.
Yeah, well, thank you for asking. And I do believe that Fitbit just announced this week that they're totally getting out of the wristband business and moving more into health and remote health. So sort of interesting as technology changes. But you really want to ask two questions when you look at any of these apps and devices and vendors and all the great sites that are out there now, and even beds that are promoting remote measurement of sleep, is two things. One, are they measuring body activity, kind of actigraphs that are built into smartphones, or are they measuring cardiovascular measures? So the problem with actigraph or body movement, as I mentioned, we know during dream sleep our voluntary muscles are pretty impaired, and the older devices are using algorithms to kind of measure when are you moving less often, and that would be a proxy, if you will, that if we had you in a sleep lab, we would actually be able to see very accurately by measuring eye movement and muscle tone and brave waves when you move into a dream sleep. But again, what these smart devices are trying to do is to guess, if you will, by looking at body movements when you move from light to deep sleep, when you move into dream sleep. And they're a problem if you have, for example, a sleep disorder like sleep apnea, which is the inability to sleep and breathe at the same time. It's become more known now, and certainly anybody that has that particular sleep disorder will wake up literally 200 to 600 times during the night, very brief periods where literally the brain is being deprived of oxygen, is forcing wakefulness, and again, helping to move out of that sleep phase into some middle phases of wakefulness to make sure that the physiology of our body isn't killing us. So what these smart devices are actually measuring incorrectly is those body movements would be very accelerated during sleep apnea, and we might in fact have very incorrect measurements if you have that type of sleep disorder. There's another very, very well-known sleep disorder called restless leg syndrome. And as you can imagine, and if anybody on the webinar has any family members or you have it yourself, you know that it is a very pernicious disease and illness that occurs during sleep, where you actually don't have a lot of feeling that your legs are just calm and relaxed. There's a constant movement. They're not a lot of fun as a bed partner. And again, these devices that are being measured by body movements are very erroneous due to a couple of sleep disorders. So what we do know is the best markers are the ones that we would have in a lab, and that's looking at cardiac output and cardiac variability of how much your heart rate changes. And we do find a pretty good correlation between the devices that are now being, the technology of the devices that are now available with measurement of sleep stages in the sleep lab. So they correlate pretty moderately high with light to deep sleep as well as dream sleep. So without getting any more detail of the neurophysiology of it, I think the question to ask is, are we measuring body movement or are we measuring cardiac type of function? And if so, cardiac variability is something you really want to try to read in the fine print of what you buy. That would be a much more accurate device for telling you when you wake up in the morning and sync it to your computer or smartphone how much sleep you got, how much wakefulness really existed, and what kind of deep sleep and even dream sleep you moved into. So great question. I hope I've adequately sort of just differentiated actigraph or body movement technology from cardiac technology that's being built into some of the newer devices.
That's wonderful. I appreciate that clarification. There's also something you mentioned earlier, and I just wanted to clarify it and also maybe probe. You mentioned Zeitgebers as being the two ways of, I'm not sure if I'm saying this correctly, but the two qualities by which we reset our clocks are light or sunlight and social or people. The people that you interact with have an effect on your sleep cycles or your sleep reorientation, I guess is the word. Maybe you can clarify for me in a moment. But the question I had for you is this. I understand how light resets our body clock through the circadian rhythms. But I wasn't quite as clear on the social side. And I was wondering if that had to do with what you were referring to later as the emotional intelligence of being surrounded by negative people and how that has a negative impact on you. Could you maybe clarify for me a bit more? Because I'm a bit confused still.
Yeah, so again, the term is called Zeitgeber. It's a German word for time setter. And for sleep, again, the two that we know and have been pretty well documented. The first, the physiology is very straightforward, that light actually will hit through cores and rods and cones to trigger the release of melatonin and inhibit melatonin. So we know the mechanism of activation and falling asleep is primarily related to light and dark. It's one of the reasons that when we're jet lagged, really getting out to a new city and getting as much sunlight as we can begins to reshift that free running aspect of our sleep and circadian rhythm and lock into the environment. The social Zeitgeber with sleep is certainly kind of an emotional contagion, but again, it doesn't really have anything to do with how happy or sad the people are. Is we tend to entrain or lock into those habits. You go to bed at 2 in the morning, unless you have tremendous willpower, you begin to adopt their lifestyle of staying up later and doing whatever night owls like to do. And you are actually, again, through the social conditioning, the social relationships in your life, shifting your clock. So there's nothing really magical about it, but who you hang around with, what your life partner is, if you have children. We raise guide dogs for the blind, and they're up very early, their biological clocks. We have one puppy that's 8 months old right now, and literally about 5 o'clock every morning, whatever triggers their let's get up and play, I'm right there with them, whether I'd like to sleep in or not. So that social environment of where we're at has actually shifted my sleep. I've always been one of those morning larks or morning people to begin with. Now with this latest guide dog puppy, both my wife and I are now shifted probably an hour more than we normally did. It's just, again, the social environment that's causing our circadian rhythm to move. And we do that consciously, as I mentioned, when on Saturday we have an opportunity, perhaps undisturbed, to catch up on our sleep or sleep in. We are, again, shifting our sleep cycle. And if we're doing that with a partner, it just becomes part of our normal lifestyle. So that's the social Zeitgeber, again, independent from happiness or emotionality. and more of the lifestyle practices that are accompanied with hanging out with the people that are around you.
Well, it sounds to me like perhaps one of the next areas of inquiry that would be really valuable is the Zeitgeber social change for first-time parents.
There we go.
Well,
Dr. Parents are one of the most sleep-deprived, folks, and again, the reason parents feel pooped out, cranky, and there's more conflict in the relationship has a direct relation to getting inadequate rest and sleep. You've got to respond, obviously, to the baby's needs and their cycle. And a newborn, as you probably saw in the sleep architecture, spends a great deal of time, tremendous amount of time in sleep and non-sleep, and a tremendous amount of time in REM or rapid eye movement sleep.
Well, as many years ago, but I can still remember it as if it was yesterday. I do recall those months of sleeplessness. So, Dr. Nowak, thank you so much for taking this time with us to share this research. I found it really eye-opening, to pardon the pun, and especially the correlation between sleep deprivation in leaders and low morale in employees, I think has incredible context to 21st century work environments where there's so much disruptive change taking place that requires high cognitive agility. I think this kind of research could be very, very useful for many companies. I really appreciate you spending your time with us. I'm just going to wrap things up by saying that this session will be archived in STADA's YouTube channel, and subscribe to the channel if you'd like to watch or share the recorded version of today's web session. Or you can check out STADA's website or follow us on social media to get the latest insights in the area of workplace learning and development. Dr. Nowak, thank you so very much for joining us today, and we hope you have a wonderful evening.
Thank you very much, and thank all of you for joining us this morning.
Thank you very much. Have a great day.